Hello and welcome to this video lecture that I've prepared for Christian Theology 2 here at Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary, taught by yours truly, Melinda. Before we get into the particular content of this video lecture series, though, I want to apprise you of the fair use notice that governs both this particular video as well as the series as a whole. This video contains content that's protected by copyright. Unless otherwise noted, that content appears here in a manner protected by fair use guidelines as defined in Section 107 of the U.S. Copyright Act. Please respect the limitations of these guidelines. Do not distribute this course material beyond students enrolled in HTE 528, Christian Theology 2, in its various formats. Thank you. This artwork, which was untitled and undated, was created by Pierre-Henri Matisse. I've chosen it to accompany our work with pneumatology because there's so much energy in it. But there's a secondary reason. You'll notice that in capturing this ordinary view out his window, Matisse has also managed to capture in one moment the three primary symbols or representations of the Holy Spirit: that of fire, represented in the sun, water in the ocean, and wind, which shows up in the cresting of the wave and in the lift of the bird's wings. Water, wind, flame. Pneumatology. This video lecture series has 3 parts to it, and before we get into the finer points of part 1, I want to give you an overview of the entire series. Here in part 1, I'm going to offer a review of some important concepts and use them to launch us into a kind of framework that I put together for relating the theological loci of Christian Theology 1 and Christian Theology 2 together as a whole. Remember, the word locus or loci refers to centers of activity, attention, or concentration, which makes it a fitting way to describe these various centers of activity, attention, concentration of theological ideas that we give focus and priority to when we do systematic theology. Part 2 will offer you a refresher about Revelation and Trinitarian theology, and I'm going to use that refresher to build a bridge from the various loci that you looked at in Christian Theology 1 to pneumatology. And then in part 3, I'll continue the focus on pneumatology by identifying some of the important theological issues that come into focus when we look at things pneumatologically rather than, for example, Christologically. So here we go with part 1, connecting the dots. Now, as I've already mentioned, I'll be offering some review and then a framework for connecting these various theological loci. You might want to grab the CT loci document that's posted on Moodle and have it either printed out or popped up on your screen to help follow along once we get to this framework. We are working in this class with a basic definition of theology as God talk. That is, theology is our speech about what we understand faith in God to mean. And our approach to developing that God talk is largely systematic, among other things. But again, here we're going to be I want to focus in on the systematic dimension of this. So systematic theology is our speech about what we understand faith in God to mean in a style that emphasizes comprehensiveness, coherence, and clarity. We're also giving attention to what we call reconstructive theology, taking you back to Rebecca Chopp and Mark Taylor's explanation or characterization of reconstructive theology. This methodological approach, has 4 features to it. So reconstructive theology is language and knowledge about God that is critical and faithful, historical and contextual, organized around symbols and doctrines, and fourth, developed as a form of communal praxis. This emphasis on communal praxis is the reason why I love giving the assignment of theological reflection, of the process of and engaging a process of theological reflection in small groups in this course. Now, this particular part of the video lecture series, though, is focused in on this third feature of reconstructive theology, paying attention to how we organize our God talk around symbols and particularly doctrines, or what we're calling theological loci. We're also giving in this course a lot of attention to theological method, and I've already introduced you to Howard Stone and James Duke's two-part definition of theological method from their book, How to Think Theologically. The first part of the definition focuses on this process of theological reflection, or underscores the importance of that by explaining that theological method is the procedure followed in the process of theological reflection. They also note that theological method refers to the study of the sources, the ordering of topics and materials, and third, the criteria for evaluating a theology. Again, in this video lecture, or this installment of the video lecture series, I'm focusing in on this second part of the second sentence, the ordering of topics and materials. So here are the list of theological loci featured in Christian Theology 1 and Christian Theology 2. On the left-hand side of the screen, you see the 8 theological loci that were part of your work in Christian Theology 1. And then on the right side of the screen, you see the 7 loci that we're going to be focusing on in Christian Theology 2. So I put these up here just both to jog your memory, but also demonstrate that this is the kind of the systematic quality of our approach to theology in these two courses, right? There is an ordering of topics, right? And there is a sense that there is a kind of movement through these things. So that in Christian Theology 1, in looking at creation, God and the Trinity, Christology, salvation, soteriology, so on and so forth, these are a lot of the sort of the big foundational concepts, and certainly Revelation and Scripture as well, that are important to help you gain a sense of, when we speak of God, who and what are we talking about, and who are human beings in relationship to God. Here in Christian Theology 2, you'll notice that pneumatology takes us back to the Trinity, but the other loci that we're going to be looking at, particularly ecclesiology, Mariology, discipleship, theology of culture, and theology of religions, have a lot more to do with the human side of the God-human interaction that is requisite for doing and producing theology, right? The context of faith is relationship between humans and God. Now, to map some of this out visually, I'm going to walk you through now my methodological framework. And what you'll notice here on the screen, there will be 2 screens here, or 2 slides. The first showing the loci that were that were emphasized or focused on in Christian Theology 1, and then the second here in Christian Theology 2. So the God and human circles here are both in relationship with each other, but they're different sizes, and there's a space in between the two. They do not overlap. And this is intentional because it's reinforcing the idea that God is, to operate out of a kind of Karl Barth's paradigm, God is wholly other than who and what we are as humans, right? God is uncreated and we are created creatures. God is infinite and we are finite. But there are these moments we'll see both in the loci of Christian Theology 1 and then Christian Theology 2, where these spheres, these circles, come into contact with each other. Okay. And the loci help mediate that sense of connection. So here in Christian Theology 1, well, let me just reinforce that theological method involves attending to the ordering of themes and topics central to outlining and communicating what it means to have faith in God, right? And part of having faith in God, part of the purpose of God Talk for us as Christians, is to help us bear witness to the Christian message of good news. So between CT1 and CT2, as we've seen, there are 15 theological loci. Again, these centers of activity, attention, or concentration. And what I want to offer you in this framework is a way of thinking about how these loci relate to each other. So God, who creates, redeems, and sustains the cosmos, communicates with us. And we call this communication revelation, right? This communication crosses the boundaries of God's infinite nature and our finite nature as an act of love. So it is love that characterizes the Trinity. Then this communication extends and continues in Christology, where in the incarnation, God's infinite nature embraces our finite nature. That is, God becomes human. Now, even as we celebrate the power of the incarnation, as Christians, we have to acknowledge that the Christian world remains divided about the nature of who Christ is, what he communicates to us, and how he communicates with us. Now, as we think about bringing, the next move, let's put it let me back up and say the next move that I'll make here in connecting up these loci is to the umbrella of what I call theological anthropology. Well, I mean, not just me, but what is referred to as theological anthropology. And we start here with the Imago Dei, the doctrine of the human being. Biblical theology and faith affirms that we are different among creation's creatures. We might call ourselves housekeeping earth creatures after Adam, the first human who is an earth, Adam meaning earth creature. We are stewards of earth, made of earth, but we also have the capacity to undo creation. This brings us to hamartiology, or the doctrine of sin. Our capacity to miss the mark, which is what hamartia means, is one way we name our brokenness and sinful identity, which is another ingredient of biblical theology and faith. And then there is theodicy, the nature of evil and suffering. Now, theodicy is an explanation for why it is that God allows evil to exist, or a justification for God's attributes in the face of evil and sin. Now, evil and sin here are referring to both natural evil and human sin. Natural evil being illness, disease, war, natural disasters, this kind of thing that plague us as human beings, and we wonder why. Now, there's another component to theological anthropology that is discipleship, but that's coming in the next slide with Christian theology too. So with that said, let's shift now. You'll notice here that the size of the God circle and the us circle have shifted a bit. This is again representing what I mentioned earlier, that here in Christian theology too, the loci that we're going to be focusing on tend to be weighted more on the side of theological anthropology. So because we're operating out of a Trinitarian framework, we understand God to be Creator and Christ, and where we begin in Christian theology too is with pneumatology, working with the first or the third person of the Trinity to kind of round out the work you did in Christian Theology 1. Now, when we bring pneumatology, or our spirit talk, into the methodological framing, and we center pneumatology in a new way, we are taking seriously what it means to think about God's animating breath in our lives and the process of sanctification that is being made new, and how that opens up new pathways of thinking about the human divine relationship. From pneumatology, we will move then to ecclesiology. And one of the things that I'll be talking about in other parts of this video lecture series is why pneumatology and ecclesiology tend to be clustered together. No spoil. I'm tempted to give you a spoiler alert, but I think I'll refrain from doing that. Our church talk, that is our ecclesiology, is an avenue for us to ponder how the triune God desires and inspires us to perform acts of praise, lament, solidarity, and service in the face of sin and struggle. In one of the readings that you'll do for this particular locus, Peter Hodgson and Robert Williams point out that in the strictest sense, as Christians, we don't believe in the church, we believe in God. So when we speak of the church, we are working against or with this temptation to think that somehow the institution of the church is of God in a maybe supernatural way. So one of the reasons why I've represented or placed ecclesiology very much on the human circle and at a bit of a distance from the God circle is to symbolically or to represent this dynamic, where we want to keep in mind that the doctrine of the church is not about elevating this human institution of the church to have a special sacred meaning or divine role or place in society, even though it's very tempting to believe that, right? And this is going to be hard for some of us Anabaptist types who tend to be very church focused, very ecclesiologically focused in our theological perspective. From ecclesiology, we are going to move to Mariology. And this may seem strange, again, in an Anabaptist context, to be doing Mariology. But one of the reasons why I like incorporating Mariology into Christian theology too is because, first of all, you'll notice that Mariology becomes a point of connection between humans and God. Why is that? Because how else was God going to be born into human form except through a woman, right? So when we speak of Mary and Mariology as non-Catholics, we have an avenue for reflecting theologically on the gendered aspect of Christian living. Now, Catholic Mariology allows us to do this as well, but one of the things we'll see is that when we are not confined by Catholic dogma around Mary, we have a broader, more discursive space to pay attention to the fact that God cares about particular bodies and every body. Again, I'm going to resist the temptation to offer some spoilers about what all that looks like. In an Anabaptist context, though, our consideration of Mary seeks to be in conversation with other Christian traditions, and we're also hoping and seeking to mediate the divides among Roman Catholicism, Protestantism, and other free church understandings of who Mary is. From Mariology, we're going to move into discipleship, which again is part of this theological anthropology umbrella. So Christian community is like a body knit together by and through God's grace. One way we express our theological anthropology is through discipleship. As human beings, God's generative and regenerative grace knits us together as interdependent parts. And because of this interdependency that we have, one of the things we see is that how we live matters. So here in CT2, the discipleship locus is going to be one of the places where we will be talking about spirituality and ethics and how those things integrate with systematic theology. This also then connects to theological reflection. Now, while I'm not going to be treating theological reflection as a separate locus. That is, it's not the topic of one of our sessions in class where I'll be delivering lectures. I do want to raise it here as one of the loci in a kind of foundational or sort of behind the scenes ways of paying attention to these areas of concern and focus and concentration. And in this case, theological reflection helps us attend to how God is at the center of reality, experienced through our particular lives, concerns, and passions, right? So in other words, what we're doing is we're giving expression to our experience as a venue for theological attentiveness and inquiry, right? From Mariology to discipleship to culture, our theology of culture describes our understanding of the intersection of human endeavors and a Christian message of good news. So this locus calls for fostering our theological imagination, as well as fostering creative ways to communicate the gospel to the people of our time. Theology of culture is a vast area within theology. And so I'm going to be focusing in on these dimensions that I just named, sort of thinking about what it means to be. So again, we're touching here on dimensions of theological anthropology, but what does it mean to create and build culture? And how do we use culture as a pathway for engaging the people around us, the world around us, and the meaning of the gospel in particular contexts, in particular times and moments, right? That's what theology of culture is interested in helping us think through. From there, we will turn next to theology of religions. Now, our God talk about other religions is one of the ways that we give or it calls us to consider how our openness and Christian commitments promote communion with God, as well as neighborliness with other human beings who have religious commitments that are different than our own. So in our theology of religions, we begin with this idea that we are neighbors, right? And the question becomes, what does it look like and what does it mean to love our neighbors when our neighbors have other religious commitments that are different from our own? After theology of religions, we turn to eschatology. And as we speak of last things and the life that is to come, we're also sort of completing the circle, because the language of eschatology is the language of unveiling and revealing, right? Which takes us back to one of the starting places for theology. Where is everything we know going? What new thing will God reveal to us in the future? What does it mean to say that God is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end? These are the questions that we will be wrestling with, but I also hope that this framework of thinking through how the loci are connected, and begin to sort of encompass one another. Helps you engage this interplay between focusing in on a particular topic and then zooming out, and in this dynamic back and forth of connection and focus, right? To close this part of the video lecture, I want to just remind us of what Robert King has offered us. If there can be said to be a single overriding task for theology at the present time, it is to recover a sense of the wholeness, that is, the unity and integrity of the Christian witness. And so these loci are one way that we attempt to do that, right? To pay attention to the themes, the concepts, the ideas, the places of activity and focus and concentration that we need to be conversant with to be able to faithfully and with integrity speak of our faith in God as a way of extending Christian witness. The Pneumatology video lecture continues with part 2. We'll see you online.